Negotiations are continuing on Capitol Hill as Congress works to reach agreements on coronavirus relief and government funding before the end of the year. Government funding is set to expire on Friday, but lawmakers are expected to pass a resolution which would push that deadline back by a week. At the end of the month, 12 million Americans will lose unemployment benefits, and millions more could be evicted from their homes unless additional coronavirus relief legislation is passed. For more, I want to bring in Jennifer Haberkorn. She's a congressional reporter for the Los Angeles Times. Thanks so much for joining us, Jennifer. So some of the biggest sticking points in this latest round of negotiations surround liability protections for businesses and funding for state and local governments. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell had been pushing for liability protections, but he appeared to back away from them on Tuesday. Here's some of what he had to say.
It remains my view that we ought to pass what we can agree on. And I think that's a pretty broad area that includes PPP, vaccine delivery, additional assistance to healthcare providers, and a variety of other things that are not controversial. What I recommend is we set aside liability and set aside state and local and pass those things that we can agree on, knowing full well we'll be back at this after the first of the year.
So, Jennifer, how significant is McConnell's move away from liability protections, and what items did Democrats and Republicans agree on?
Hi, Elaine. Yeah, so this was a pretty significant move, if only because McConnell for about 6 months now has been saying that these liability protections were a red line for Senate Republicans, that no further COVID relief was going to pass the Senate without it. So this is a sign that he wants to move the ball forward, but he put a condition on it. He said Democrats would have to drop their interest in funding for state and local governments. Democrats, feel that's a very important part of their deal. That money would go to funding local workers. Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, has called them the heroes. And so there's little reason to think that Democrats are actually going to go along with this. But it's certainly a sign that everyone on Capitol Hill feels like they really need to pass some kind of COVID relief measure before the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question here, because I guess why now? I mean, this issue of liability protection, for instance, as you mentioned, has been something that we had heard about for months. And to change position now, I think a lot of Americans might be wondering, why is this taking so long?
I think you're right. And I think that question that everyone's asking is really getting to lawmakers. And they feel like they cannot go home for the end of the year, for the winter holidays, without getting something done. They're also going to have to vote, as you mentioned earlier, by Friday to fund the government. And I think some lawmakers are going to have a really hard time saying that they voted to fund the government and they're going home without getting COVID relief done. So that pressure is definitely brewing. And I think also, there's some gamesmanship here about, which party is going to be held responsible if a deal doesn't get together. So, everyone has incentive to make it look like they're the ones who are trying really hard to get a deal, trying to make concessions, even if they're concessions that the other party isn't going to go along with.
And Jennifer, we know that a group of 6 Democratic senators led by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are calling for direct payments to be included in the next relief bill. Is there any appetite for that on Capitol Hill?
This is a really interesting thing because I think a lot of lawmakers on the Democratic side really want to see some kind of direct payment to individuals in a relief bill. There's been some skepticism on the Republican side. There's some Republican lawmakers who really want to see that as well. As of right now, it's a little hard to see that happening, if only because they're having such a hard time getting anything done. That's not part of the measure that perhaps has the most momentum behind it right now. But as you mentioned, there's high-profile lawmakers pushing this, such as Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And clearly the public, those people who have been unemployed or have been negatively affected by the pandemic, really want to see some direct relief as part of a deal.
Well, I also want to ask you about the National Defense Authorization Act, which provides the annual budget for the Defense Department. The White House is threatening to veto it, but top lawmakers on the House Armed Services Committee have said they will override it. Senator McConnell also had this to say on Tuesday. Let's listen.
We haven't failed to pass the NDAA for 60 years. If it comes over from the House, obviously I'm going to put it on the floor, and it's my intention to vote for it.
So, Jennifer, take us through this. Why is the president threatening a veto here, and how significant would it be for lawmakers to override it?
So this is the military spending bill that passes every year. It's passed for 59 years straight, annually on Capitol Hill, so it has usually a lot of bipartisan support. Lawmakers feel like they can't let this bill lapse because military raises would lapse. But President Trump has said that he would only sign it if it includes changes to social media policy, Section 230, as it's known on Capitol Hill. Clearly, President Trump has a lot of frustrations with social media companies, and he wants to see this military spending bill address that. But lawmakers on Capitol Hill argue that these are unrelated issues, and even Republicans do not want to go along with it. They don't want to risk this military spending bill being caught up in, frankly, one of President Trump's, latest Twitter rants. So I've been surprised by the fact that Republicans are saying that they're going to do this, without President Trump's provision, and they're ready to override his veto. Republicans don't want to do that. They don't want to have to veto, override the veto of a president of their party, but they say that they're ready to do it. And, they might have the votes to do it. I think it would get really down to the line. We would see this play out in the next approximately 2 weeks because President Trump would have some time to figure out how he's going to respond. For now, Republicans are hoping that they can pass this bill with such an overwhelming majority that it would really convince President Trump not to veto it and make it clear that Congress could, frankly, embarrass him on one of the last bills in his presidency if they're able to override his veto.
All right, a lot to watch in the days and weeks ahead. Jennifer Haberkorn. Jennifer, always great to have you. Thank you.
Thanks for